Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven. Today we have Matthew Gordon. Matthew Gordon's short fiction has appeared in Amazing Stories, in High Shelf Press, in the Quilliad, and in the Exhibitionist. His nonfiction has appeared in the Huffington Post, the Sporting News, the Billfold, and on RealGM.com. He has lived in Ontario, New York, Texas, and Alberta. He now lives in his hometown of Toronto, Ontario. So welcome, Matthew. So
Feels
Matthew,
good to be here.
tell us a little bit about yourself and all the different things you do.
What don't I do? It feels like it's sometimes. I've been writing basically my entire life. I first started writing fiction when I was 4 years old. I think it's kind of like anyone who sees someone else's finished work. It's just like watching hockey or basketball on TV and saying, well, I could do that. Maybe not quite as well as those guys, but I could do that. So it's been a long haul for me writing fiction. I actually have an English and history degree with a psych minor from Laurier, so developed that interest for a long time, and I've been practicing law for the past 2 years. It's been a bit more intermittent since the pandemic because it's been difficult in everybody's business, but a lot of experience there as well. I generally speaking, love hypotheticals. I love running with things. Most of my writing could be generally called speculative fiction, whether that's exactly what blend of science fiction or fantasy or horror is up to the readership to decide. But I've also written a fair number of other things, including a couple more kind of contemporary literary drama type efforts. And then I also broke into, I guess you could call it travel writing or journaling of all things. So I lived in Guelph, Ontario, a really nice, cute little city. And one of my friends co-founded their arts and literature magazine. So I wrote them a big spiel inset with my own pictures. I like to think I'm one of the better phone photographers out there. And so you can now read as it unfolds over the course of the year what it was like to live in Guelph for a year as a still relatively young adult. Um, Even more recently, I completed, and this is something that I hope is going to be getting released fairly soon, but we shall see. I finished writing a 20,000 word novella about a dragon and a goblin who have a very Ren and Stimpy like relationship. The goblins that live in Butler. And our story opens with the unfortunate announcement that due to the plummeting price of gold, the dragon can no longer afford to pay the Orcish contractors who renovated his lair. So they've registered a lien on title. And in order to raise the money to pay off the orcs, the dragon sends his goblin butler with a wagon to the biggest flea market in the Dragonverse, where everyone is trying to trade goods and trade up and make money. And our goblin is tasked with sifting through the dragon's hoard, finding anything that might be of value. And then you remember a few years ago how that guy from Montreal traded a paperclip for a house with all different intermediate stages like that.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
there's
okay.
magical items, a lot of slapstick physical comedy, and I definitely got some of my beta readers spitting out their coffee.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Beta readers. Now, you also told me you also edit as well.
Yeah. Yeah, at any given time, I'm probably editing anywhere on the range from 8 to 10 novels.
8 to 10
So it's
novels, like a year?
at the same time.
Okay,
So,
okay.
so I'm a member of a very intensive Zoom writing workshop, um, and so we edit a chapter of everybody else's novel every 2 weeks, and then the line edits go up in the Google Drive, and then we have a rather lengthy Zoom discussion about all of them. So that's been quite the effort. Plus, also got another friend who is going to be publishing the his second book in this current series. And so I edited that as well, and so did a bunch of his other friends. And then I also, just earlier in 2023, joined the Historical Fiction Writers of Toronto. So that is a couple chapters every couple of weeks. So it doesn't get boring.
Sounds like you're doing a lot of intense writing, editing activities, and you're a lawyer. So how do you manage your time? Because you're doing so many things and like in one day. Like, how does your day look like? Like, do you plan it from the beginning or for the week?
Um, Not so much because I mean, with things like editing, I can't control when the work comes in. With things like writing, I know you're supposed to write every day, but I figure if I do editing or I do research or I write a blog article, that's sufficient writing for any given day. Um, and I was mentioning just before the recording came on that part of this game is submitting stories to publishers, literary magazines, this, that, and the other thing. So I was looking back through my submission blitz, I call it. I got a Microsoft Excel file showing all of my submissions since the start of 2023, and they'll be submitted. A couple of weeks ago, I submitted a story on a Sunday at 11 p.m. So you have to kind of give up on the idea of keeping normal hours when you're doing all this kind of stuff. The other thing I would say in terms of time management is, um, I have other I have hobbies, right? I don't just work myself into the ground all day every day. So kind of two of the main things that keep me grounded that I really appreciate. One is home cooking, and the other one's exercise. Um, during the lockdowns, I bought myself a treadmill and got into long distance running. And I checked over a number of months, and eventually, because I canceled my gym membership, the treadmill paid for itself. So that was kind of nice. But if I'm going to be doing a lot of writing or editing, maybe it's just a couple mile run instead of a half marathon, or maybe it's frozen lasagna night instead of me, cooking up a storm, right? So it's all about just kind of keeping that balance, as well as the fact that obviously the the law itself doesn't really move at a very quick pace, but a lot of deadlines do. And so something nice about fiction, because I used to be a sports writer, and there's no way you could be a lawyer and a sports writer at the same time. You'd be too many conflicting deadlines. But with fiction, especially with longer projects, or especially when submission deadlines are weeks out, I can punt something off for a few days. It's not my preferred way to do things, because I think, you don't go into fiction writing for the money. I think we all have a passion for it and all have a drive for it. But if the idea in my head that's just smoldering away has got to get written on Sunday instead of Wednesday, then it's got to get written on Sunday instead of Wednesday. And that actually gives you a bit more time to think as well. So I've put up some pretty good outputs before. So I had this one idea for a historical horror story that takes place in Edmonton in the 1890s, out near where I used to live. And a couple days of note taking, including on Via Rail, because you got to be flexible like that. You got to be ready to do that. And the first draft was 5,800. I shortened it to a bit under 5K, but I wrote the first draft in an evening. So, once you have those ideas percolating for a bit, you can really get your speed up and get them out.
Now, do you have any tools that you use to manage your time in the day?
Um, I mean, I know this is kind of old school and low tech by today's comparisons, but a lot of Word and Excel.
Mm-hmm.
I currently have about a dozen Word tabs open. And then Excel, I mean, as I said, I'll keep track of my submissions. I've done word count per day files before, but I find that if you're doing a combination of writing, editing, researching, and blogging, then you can't really approximate it as well as if you're just writing something.
Yeah.
So, I kind of wish I were more diligent with that one. Then in terms of kind of more writing intensive tools, the only tool I've ever really used all that extensively, and even then only a little bit, is Citation, the cloud-based app where you actually can do things like draw little plot and character webs. So you'll see how everybody's connected to everybody else. So I'd recommend that one.
Citation. Is it like a web program?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to
It's
put a link after.
so it's still at citation.app. Let's see. Yep. Yeah, and it's really more of a, as I mentioned, it's less about the editing piece and more about organizing your thoughts. Because look, if I need something that isn't pictorial, I've got Word for that. If I'm going to use an additional tool, I want to make flowcharts. I've used Lucidchart before. Or I want to make some sort of a web or something, or I want to do the kind of thing that historically you do with a pencil and paper.
And like family charts, in any of your stories?
Yeah, only a little bit.
Okay,
More
cool.
so like writing a ghost story and who's haunting whom kind of stuff.
Okay. Now, I've had people ask me this question because you have a day job. I have a day job. And people are like,
Well, I'm
"Oh, would you ever
just
quit?"
keeping in mind that I'm just doing contract
Oh,
remote
that's
research
okay.
right now,
So
so
you
I'm
get to
not.
pick and choose when you want to work, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. But I mean, I've done the whole writing and editing thing while having traditional law firm hours before. So,
Hmm.
and I probably will again soon. So, I mean, just because I'm doing contract legal research and writing right now doesn't mean that that's as busy as I ever get.
Yeah, because some people have asked me like, "Do you want to quit your job to write?" But I was like, writing is such a long game. I think
Mhm.
financially it's kind of hard. Well, if you hit the lottery, it'll be nice, like J.K. Rowling. But how many of us are gonna hit the lottery? Let's be honest. So, yeah. Okay. So, do you have any writing advice for people that are starting to write and how to focus, that kind of thing?
Well, I would say for just very, very general tips, because I imagine the listeners are going to be writing all genres, all word counts, things like that. Um, the first thing I would say is by the time you get to be about university aged, you should have pretty much perfect spelling and grammar. So that's something that, when I go back and I'm editing my own work or my beta readers are editing my work, and I've got about 10 of them, um, I know and they know they don't need to be crossing out typos and stumbling over unfortunate phrasing or what have you. And we can really get down to the brass tacks of the story development of the characters, that sort of thing. It just, the fewer typographical headaches you give yourself, the cleaner your edit's going to be and the faster you can actually get to the stuff that matters. Other tips I would give, one would be know what your word count is. Don't think so much in terms of page count because different publishers, especially different e-reader formats, will make it all sorts of things. It's also why I've actually written a choose your own adventure book, but it's a tough one to get published in this day and age because it actually does matter what's on page 8 or whatever, right? So what I would say there is have an idea of what kind of publishers you're going to be targeting, whether you're going to self-publish, magazines, full-length novel publishers, and do what they say. Certainly something that publishers and agents really focus in on is an author who can't read and follow basic instructions is not going to be someone they want to work with, no matter, even if they wrote the next Harry Potter or something, right?
Oh,
So so I would say definitely, and I would even say preferably know going into whatever it is you're going to write. Again, you don't have to be a complete plotter. You can be a bit of a pantser too, but you should at least have an idea of your genre, your length and word count, kind of when you're going to hit your story beats, when you're going to be completing story arcs.
I think you're the first person to mention plotter or panzers on my podcast. Do you want to explain a little bit about the
Sure.
difference?
So this is a term Stephen King came up with in his book on writing, which I thought was quite great. essentially, a plotter is someone who has legions and legions of notes and has everything planned out before they even write their first line. Whereas a pantser, also called a discovery writer, is someone who just they write and we'll see what comes out. I think everyone's kind of a cross between the two. I don't think you go in knowing, like, look, if you go into your writing your novel knowing what every word's going to be, that's not called planning. That's called a first draft. Um, by the same token, I don't think anybody would start writing a novel without even having a basic idea of something like whether it takes place on Earth. So, I'm probably a bit more plotter, but I also it's also very different based on especially my setting. So I've actually recently been subjecting my beta readers to a world I created that is loosely based off of 19th century Central and Eastern Europe in a fantastical type setting. Suffice to say, the amount of note taking required for that is truly off the charts. I probably have more pages of notes than of actual writing, even though I've finished a manuscript for that. Whereas I'm writing a novel right now that's a ghost story that takes place in a fictitious city loosely based off of, Toronto, Hamilton, Cleveland, Buffalo, a few other places. So that I can pretty well, I can really figure out going in kind of what I need that setting to tell me because it'll be a lot more familiar to the reader.
Now because you also write nonfiction, so would you say you would plot more than nonfiction? Because it's a different type of writing?
Um, I would say it really depends what it is. So if I'm writing like a law blog article or something like that, I try to keep them to 1,000 words, so I don't do a whole ton of planning for those. It'll be maybe a page of jot notes. Whereas if I'm planning something longer, I haven't written anything really long form recently, but you know, back in the olden days when I was writing academic papers, I mean, those are just so incredibly well noted out, including plug and play citations and everything. So depends.
It depends. It depends. Okay. So now you had mentioned beta readers. Where do you find your beta readers?
A few places. One is the various local writers events. Like when we were out a couple weeks ago, the historical fiction writers group is good for that too. Um, I'm blessed enough to be the proud holder of an English degree. I know that makes everybody else jealous of me. So even just friends who I met while doing an English degree or friends who I met in law school. But then my biggest stable of beta readers actually came from Quora. So
Oh,
the social network that doesn't like referring to itself as a social network, um, and I have over 2,600 followers on Quora. So and I love to post answers on things like writing tips. So that's become a really convenient place to network with other writers.
now I have a writing friend that is very scared to talk about her projects. So I imagine beta readers, she would be very frightened of them. Like, do you have any fears about people taking your stories at all?
Well, that's one of two reasons I've heard of people kind of being afraid of beta readers. Um, the two things I'd say to that is one, don't worry about people taking your ideas because writing is such a self-absorbed, egotistical game that everyone wants their own ideas getting out there, not somebody else's.
Mhm.
And the second thing I would say is that if you're doing an edit swap, which is how I'll do it with my friends, look, they got your ideas, but you got theirs too. I mean, if you want to turn this into a hostage crisis, you can turn this into a hostage crisis. But ultimately, you have just as much of their writing as they have of yours.
Mhm.
So, and then lastly, what I would say is that, and I mentioned this in a core answer recently, the idea is the execution. So here's an interesting example. Let's say we're chatting over a beer and you tell me just a one liner, wouldn't it be great if there was a book about XYZ, whatever it is. So I go and I research XYZ, and then I write outlines. I come up with a plot, come up with a main character, come up with a character arc, And then I actually write a solid couple hundred pages of this, to which I would say that's way more my idea than it is yours in that situation. It's sitting down and actually cranking out 200 pages takes a lot more thought and a lot more of an idea than saying a one-liner over a beer. So what I would say is, easy way to remember it, the idea is the execution. They're the same thing.
Yeah, it also reminds you about how all the plots in the world have already been told, so everyone's just rewriting the same thing over and over again, like you see Romeo and Juliet in various different forms. So yeah, there's only so many stories, I guess.
My current couple projects, I think, are pretty unique plot-wise, but I guess you can be the judge of that at some point.
Okay, Matthew, so you're going to do a reading for us. Can you tell us a little bit before you start about what the story is about?
Absolutely. So this is a short horror story that takes place in Toronto in the 1920s. It's called Wound Salter. I wrote it right in the opening days of the pandemic, and then I got a newsletter invite to submit to the Quilliad, which is a local magazine. So I duly submitted, and then I duly got published. And so this is from issue 12, which is from November 2020. So it's not my latest work, but I thought it'd be an interesting one for two reasons. One, because Toronto's where we met, so we got to got to keep that theme going. And then two, because it is what I would consider to be a very typical length for anybody who's interested in submitting their own work to literary magazines. You'll see a lot of calls for submissions that are sub 2000, sub 2500. So this 1800 really, I think, hits the sweet spot in terms of that. Plus, it's horror. Everyone loves horror. And now we'll begin. Truth is an honest thief. She brings you back your mirror. The rest of the doors were plain, wooden, and locked. The wound salter's door was framed by ornately carved gold cast into angels blowing their trumpets at a shimmering diamond star. Its silver portcullis swung open for every entrant to the wound salter's premises, always far enough to reveal the foyer inside. The foyer's walls were wood-paneled, with all the wainscoting expected of a turn-of-the-century mansion. On either side, there was a wooden door with a brass handle molded into the shape of a roaring lion's head. Straight ahead, the double doors opened to a gaudy new gaslit chandelier and then to forked staircases, one that led toward a variety of much-required cleaning rooms, the other toward the turret where the wound salter maintained his operations. Within the turret, to one side, there was an unlocked sitting room where anyone could wait to engage the wound salter, but which laid regretfully empty, despite its marble fireplace, array of accent couches, and immense bay window that overlooked the castles and the streets below. To the other side lay the wound salter's office door, inlaid with a large opaque bottom panel. The top panel was frosted so that all anyone who looked through it could tell was whether the light was on. Behind that door, the wound salter held court. A flurry of inconsistent light and thunderclaps jolted Hope Altmark into the realization that the person before her was not yet finished. A scream rang out as the light inside the room flickered again. The door shook on its hinges. Another flicker, another scream. It sounded to Hope like whoever was in there was being struck by lightning. A soft gurgling sound took over the silent airwaves, making Hope wonder if the person inside the room was bleeding from the mouth, before another scream proved her wrong. Hope straightened her white leather gloves, which still held a dark mottling from the snow that had fallen on her right before she passed the portcullis. Her breath sped with the increasing frequency of lightning strikes and screams. She felt like she was spying on this previous attendee, but her ear strayed closer to the frosted panel, as though she were hearing Medusa. She could feel the cold of the frosted panel through her cloche hat. The wound salter's office door opened as if by itself, without a controlling human hand. A puff of black smoke dissipated as Hope entered the room, breathing shallowly and softly. The wound salter was the only person present. He sat behind an immense cherry desk adorned with only a small brass table clock whose ticking matched Hope's pulse. The face was pointed toward the wound salter, leaving a circular molded lion to glare at her. Please, the wound salter said in a soft, coarse voice, take a seat. I imagine you booked this appointment to discuss a transaction with me. I won't have you doing that standing up. Hope looked around at the walls. They had inlaid bookshelves packed with tomes she couldn't recognize because the shelves were so far away and the print was so small. Behind the wound salter stood another bay window, this one with a starry night behind it. Hope sat, confused, in the only chair facing the wound salter's desk. She'd arrived at midday. Sorry, I'm just a little jittery, I suppose, Hope said, fiddling with her dress under the desk. I thought I heard someone in here a minute ago and that maybe I was interrupting. Time passes quickly in these halls, the wound salter explained to an unsatisfied Hope. That's also why you didn't see the last person to visit me, even though you thought you might have seen something. The thunderstorm inside the room, the gurgling of what Hope thought was blood, the screams, the puff of black smoke. Could Hope have dreamt them? After a series of short breaths, the wound salter began. People come to me for therapeutic reasons, he began, carefully ignoring Hope's wide brown eyes. Because they have some inner guilt or shame they feel the need to embrace. I do not ask why they seek to embrace such things, but I know by looking at them what it is that causes them so much sickness. How do you usually make evening appointments with professionals in their offices so you can walk in and interrupt them as they explain their crafts? Hope, suddenly cold, wrapped her chest in her arms. The wound salter turned to Hope, a shadow over his face below his solid charcoal fedora. He extended his hands toward the middle of his empty desk, pulling the cuffs of his starched white shirt past the cuffs of his solid charcoal suit. You're divorced, aren't you? He said. In this day and age, divorced. Hope trembled. Her ring finger itched where the rings used to be. He was a kind man, just unable to provide the precise level of lifestyle to which you became accustomed shortly before you met him, I know. The wound salter continued. I won't judge. I, too, have been of dubious material circumstances. Hope blinked repeatedly, recalling her memories of the labyrinthine trail she had taken through the first 3 parts of the wound salter's mansion. Idly, she rubbed one of the arms of her chair, the velvet soft against her exposed wrist. This mansion is not without upkeep, the wound salter said. Hope nodded so absently, she had gone far past wondering whether her senses deceived her. The imposing man in front of her did not resemble anyone she had known to exist. I don't know how you could know. I mean, about me and about Orton, about what went wrong. She would have cried if her emotional state could rise above confusion. The wound salter shook his head. I don't care that you're divorced, because that's not why you're here. What you're here to see me about is far more deep-seated than that. You could have inherited it from an ancestor or a group of them, or anyone who looks like you on the street at night. It's, dare I say, it's hardly your sin at all, but it's your guilt and it's your shame. It slits your guts from an unseen direction, and you think any amount of pain I cause you will be a tap on the shoulder by comparison. Hope's heart hurt. Admit that I'm right, the wound salter hissed, and we can proceed with the payment. You are, she said. You're right, I mean. I don't know what's going to happen here, but I need you right now. I need you, and I can't articulate why, except this feels like the only way I'll purify myself, the only way I'll set myself free. Hope unzipped her purse, which she had smartly carried over one shoulder, and which was so small it could barely hold her handkerchief, but was, in times of need, capable of carrying $5,000 in cash. Wait, Hope said as she handed over the bills, her bile climbing on her throat. Before we begin, looks right, the wound soldier said as he counted the bills. No, I know I came with the right amount. I'm nervous. I've heard there are side effects to having your wounds salted. Pain, madness, convulsions. I've heard of some people dying because of this. People do all sorts of things when they face the people they think they are, the wound soldier said. I have very little control over your situation. You do? Of course. Anything you endure here is truly of your own making, no matter what part I appear to play. I can expose your true nature to you, but any sins you've committed, Hope, those are yours alone. Now, I think it's time to give you some peace of mind. Hope shut the office door in anticipation of the treatment that was about to begin. Before she could return to her seat, tears were already streaming down her face. In such torrents, they erased her makeup and drenched her cheeks. Numbness spread through her veins as her body stiffened in shock. Her movement slowed to the point of impairment, her body barely obeying her order to sit down. When the fever set in, her head felt like the wound soldier had taken a hot iron to it, although she couldn't have, not if she'd been offered her $5,000 back and then 5,000 more, been able to tell where the wound soldier was or what he was doing. Sweat accumulated under the brim of Hope's hat. She took it off reflexively and, with no further delusion of ladyhood, wrung it like a goose's neck with her gloved hands. Her gloves came off next, dripping sweat from their insides. Her chest tightened in the suffocating heat. The bookshelves with their even more unreadable spines, the desk with its clock that sat as majestically as it could for such a device that did not tell her the time, although it could. The rug she hadn't noticed before, but whose bristles wept like sharp blades of grass at her ankles. All of it spun around and shot through her. Her awareness of the wound salter vanished, save for a hidden suspicion that the reason she could no longer sense them was because his rate of breathing matched her own. Ignatius Pemberton held the late evening appointment. He checked his pocket watch, which showed that he had arrived precisely 4 minutes before the prescribed 8 o'clock. He dusted the snow off his bowler hat as he passed through the open portcullis, a gloved hand lightly touching the silver bars to keep it from slamming shut. Once Ignatius was inside the mansion, his steps worked on muscle memory through the opulent foyer, under the gaslit chandelier, up the stairs toward the turret, past the sitting room, and then right up to the frosted office door. He briefly considered sitting on the couch by the fireplace, passing his time with a literary magazine, but then quickly thought better of it. He advanced to the wound soldier's door, hat in hand. Ignatius had been to see the wound soldier 4 times, and not once had he seen or heard what he did that night. He could have sworn that frosted door was hiding a burst of flames that crackled and spat like the wound soldier lit a bonfire. Following the flame burst was an explosion so loud it made Ignatius jump. And by the time his calf-high black boots were back on the hardwood, another explosion exceeded the first. As Ignatius moved closer to the frosted panel, he noticed the soft, unmistakable scent of a gas leak emanating from the wound soldier's room. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you tell us what was the inspiration for the story? Do you need some salting?
No, it's a couple of things. One is I've always been, fascinated by those old mansions. I actually loosely based the Wound Salter's mansion on Castle Oma, where I'd given myself a guided tour about a month before writing this story. And so I was really feeling that kind of time period, really wanting to write more horror. That's something I've kind of gotten more into over the years, I would guess. And the other thing is this idea of a a ridiculously expensive professional that, if my math is right, that $5,000 in Hope's purse, that would be about 75 grand now. So not a cheap appointment. And looking at whenever you see something crazy in the news about people paying for things that they should not be paying for, like, there's no evidence I can see in this story. I don't know what you think, whether really anything is inflicted upon these people but sheer pain. Yet, just like people who will pay for everything from vehicles with ridiculously high maintenance costs to various items that break down to things that are just plain old clutter, it is, and I think especially setting it within such a, at least by reputation, materialist era as the Roaring Twenties, right? That, well, what are people going to throw their money away at next?
Oh, very interesting. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, and I wish you the best as time goes on.
Well, thank you for having me.
For more upcoming episodes of the Artsy Raven about writing and publishing, visit us at jfgarage.com/arpodcast. A reminder to Patreon subscribers that there is bonus content available for every episode on the Patreon website. If you enjoyed the show, you can show your appreciation by buying us some digital coffee. The Artsy Raven is produced by J.F. Garrard. The voice in the show's introduction is Chris Gorman, and music is by Tim Moore. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe.